Hi guys, welcome back to Art with Miss Karen. In this week's Art Basics video, we're going to draw landscapes. So you're going to need a picture that you're familiar with or a picture of a landscape that you really enjoy looking at that you would like to draw. Make sure it has a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And I'll describe a little bit more of what that means, but basically a foreground is what's closest to you, the middle ground is a little bit farther away, and the background is the farthest away. So make sure your picture that you're working off of has those three elements in them, or you could make up a landscape from memory or from your imagination. So that's what you're going to need, and then as always a piece of paper and a pencil. So go ahead and grab those things and then let's get started. When drawing a landscape, it doesn't really matter where in perspective you begin, but you do want to think about what is farthest away, that's the background, what you see in the middle, that's the middle ground, and what is closest to you, that is the foreground. So what's closest to you might be what is the focal point of your artwork. It might be an animal, it might just be some interesting foliage, a tree, or some housing, or a barn, something like that, or a person that's in the foreground, that's the point of interest. And then as you get farther and farther away, your imagery, your landscape is not going to be as sharp, it's not going to be as in focus. So let's just go through, and maybe you have a picture that you're going off of that is, or something that you remember and you're going to draw from memory. For me, I'm just going to draw from memory, but I also have a reference photo that I am going off of, but I'm altering it to be what I want it to be. So for my drawing, I'm going to start with the background. So for now, I'm going to make a mountain range. And feel free to make your own picture. Don't just copy what I'm doing, but I'm doing this as an example. So I have my background. This is the point that is the farthest away. Okay, and we're going to add in some details a little bit later, but let me just lay out everything that we're going to have, and then we can continue to work on it. So I have my background. For the middle ground, I'll probably have a few hills, and there's probably going to be some trees that are breaking up some of those lines. We don't want it to be too monotonous, so I'll have some trees that kind of break it up a little bit. So this is my middle ground, and then for my foreground, this is where you can make it interesting, give it some dynamic. And so I can have maybe some trees that go off of the line that you can see it, and it's going to cover up some, but as the artist you can make your landscape have interest and depth as you work on it. So you can change it up to be however you want it to be. So I'm mostly just putting in some basic shapes so that if I want to erase something, I can erase it easily, and I'm not going to be getting rid of a bunch of details that I've put in. So just put in some basic shapes, basic lines, because if you decide you don't like it, you're going to need to erase it. So I've got a couple big trees here in my foreground. I think I need to bridge the distance between my foreground and my middle ground a little bit. And so I might have a path. And this is helping my composition, leading your eye through my landscape. Whether this, maybe this is going to be a creek. But one of the biggest things that you need to understand with a landscape and with anything is the perspective. When something is closest to me, it's going to be big, and it's going to start at the bottom of your paper, generally speaking. So, for example, my creek is wider as it gets to the bottom of my page, and as it gets farther away, it's getting closer to the top of my page, and it's getting thinner, it's getting smaller. Whereas even my trees start at the bottom of my page and they're thick, they're bigger when they're closer to me. And my trees that are far away are smaller and they're closer to the top of my page. So my mountains are close to the top of my page, and my plants that are close to me are at the bottom of my page. So as you're working through your landscape, continue to keep that in mind, that those rules of perspective. So I'm just going to keep on adding in some shapes and things of my foliage that's close to me. We still need some trees that show the perspective. So a tree that is in the middle ground needs to be a bit smaller than this tree that is in the foreground. And you can add more trees. I'm going to add some more over on this side as well. And as an artist, you can determine what you want your art to look like. If you have a picture that you're working off of and you want to interpret the landscape in your own way, you can definitely make your art the way you want it. If you want the creek to, or if you want to add a creek, say this is a landscape you have a picture of, but there's no creek. Well, you could add a creek to add that interest and to move your eye throughout your composition. As the artist, you get to create the composition. Just adding in some clouds. Okay, I think I'm satisfied with my composition and everything that's going on in my picture. So now I'm going to just tidy up some of the spaces. For example, my mountain is cutting through the tree that's in my foreground. So I'm going to just tidy up some lines real quick. All right, so I have my basic outlines for my landscape. And now something that is really useful is to just put in some of those shades that will help you determine with your eye where's your foreground, where's your middle ground, and your background. For the foreground, since it appears to be that we are coming out of a dense forest, this is probably a more shaded area. And so for my trees, these are going to actually be more of a darker shade than the rest. My foreground is going to be a darker shade than my surrounding landscape. So for my trees, I'm just going to add in some cross hatching. To show all of the shades that I'm putting in. And you can use any shading technique. You can go back and watch sketching and shading. I made a video on that to show different shading techniques. Today I'm using cross hatching, but you could use any shading technique you want. You could use blending. You could use stippling. That would take you a long time if you wanted to use stippling, but it can be fun, a fun way of drawing and shading. You could use hatching, which is just straight lines like this. For me, I'm using cross hatching because it just gives me a little bit more depth that I'm looking for. And if you notice, I'm not putting a lot of detail into today's sketch. This is more of a study sketch. So if I was going to take this drawing, this would be a first step to creating a painting. So if I was going to make a painting, I would do something like this before I begin my painting, because I want to know the values that I want to see in my painting. So this is a really good exercise to do a sketch like this, to put in your values before you start something with paint that takes time to dry, so you can work on the values and the darks and the lights and the composition in a sketch before you would begin a painting. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now, is just putting in some of the values. And you can also think about where your light source is coming from. In this dense forest in the foreground, there's not a lot of light coming out of the forest, but a lot of the light is coming from the open field outside of the forest. And so most of my lighter areas, so the light side of my tree is pointing or directing towards where the sun might be coming from. We don't see the sun in our landscape. You probably wouldn't see the sun in a landscape unless it was sunset, or unless you're pointing your camera up at the sky to take a picture of the sun. So don't let yourself fall into the habit of adding a sun to every single landscape, because you typically don't see the sun unless it is sunset or it's sunrise. So keep that in mind as you are drawing out your composition, that you don't have to add the sun. But do try to think about where the sun is located so that you can add in the correct direction of your light source. To make this look more like water, I'm actually going to add in a few areas of darker lines to see either a reflection, so like a reflection of this frond here in the water, or a depth to the water. And I'm not going to shade in the whole thing. I'm going to add in some grass shapes to show the detail in the foreground. Okay, let's go ahead and continue to move on to the middle ground. So my trees in the foreground are pretty dark because it is more in the shaded area. And as we get to the middle ground, you can actually make this area a lot lighter. And so I'm not pushing as hard with my pencil as I shade in these shapes. So you can definitely, it helps your eye see the difference between those two grounds, the foreground and the middle ground, just by adding those different shades. And if our light source, the sun, is coming from above us to the middle, maybe our shadow for these trees need to follow that light source. So I'm having my shadows follow. So if the light source is here somewhere, my other shadow that we don't see too much of from this other tree would be going the other direction as well. And see, these grass shapes are pretty big in the foreground. In the middle ground, they're going to be smaller because they're farther away. You can add a reflection in the creek for this tree here. Okay, so now we're going to move on to, I guess this is middle ground, but this is also part of the middle ground. So I'm going to just add in an even lighter shade than this grass is because it is just a little bit farther away. And this is called aerial perspective. So aerial perspective happens when you have the air in between those different layers of perspective. So as your perspective moves farther away, the air particles make the colors a lighter shade. So you're going to have, if you were to look at these mountains that are far away, even though there's trees that are the same color as this tree, they're going to be lighter in color because of the distance. It's going to be a lighter color. So that's why you want to make your background, the thing that is the farthest away, lighter in color and blurrier if you can do that in your sketching because it is farther away. Okay, and don't forget to add the shade of the color of your trees in the background. Thanks again for joining Art with Miss Karen. I hope you enjoyed drawing this landscape with us today. If you want to share your art with me, go ahead and send it to artwithkaren@gmail.com, and I would love to see what you did today. Also, if you have a suggestion of something that you would like to draw next time, go ahead and leave a comment down below, and I would love to see what you want to draw next week. I hope to see you guys soon.